How's it going, everybody? I am ZBilbs, and I really enjoy violent movies and video games, and we should talk about that. So I've done another kind of rambly style video like this before where I talked about if it was okay for Christians to listen to metal, and today I wanted to throw out another kind of similar controversial topic that I would like to just voice my thoughts and ideas and open it up at the end. And here's some thoughts of what other people think about this, because this is something that I've been pondering on a little bit ever since last night. And I was like, it'd be fun to make a video about this because I have a few thoughts. Now, obviously, this has been a very political topic. You have all of like the kind of video game censorship back in the 90s when there was like court appearances with like Mortal Kombat, and they ended up making the ESRB from that. And then there's been a lot of like other political stuff of like politicians pointing to why like violent movies and video games creates a violent society, and can create, murderers and all of that, like people blaming school shootings on violent media. So I wanted to talk about what kind of ways does violent media work positively or potentially detrimentally. Now, I don't know the science behind this, so I couldn't tell you anything specific there. I'm more thinking about this from a philosophical angle. I'm a philosophy and history major, so we'll see. It's going to be a little bit rambly. All the science I know there's never been a direct link between violent movies and violent video games and actual real world violence. But I do know that doesn't mean that there isn't some sort of impact that we should be aware of. Now, I wanted to start by kind of sharing just a quick story of what inspired me to make this video. And believe it or not, last night with my family, I watched the new Hunger Games movie from last year, Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. I'd already read the book, so I was interested in seeing the movie. I've seen all the other Hunger Games movies, and I liked it. I thought it was good. I'd like 6 out of 10, but that's against the point. One of my takeaways from the movie, one of my least favorite parts about this that I shared with my family after the movie ended, was the actual Hunger Games. How I realized, like, I understand the target audience for the Hunger Games movies is young adult. It was the same thing in the books, but it always just came off as kind of odd just how they would show this violence of these young kids and teenagers, like stabbing and maiming and doing all these violent actions. And then how they would show the violence, either it'd be like a quick stab and there's, no blood and they're just immediately dead, or they cut away from the violence as to keep it with that PG-13 rating. And for some reason, that just really rubbed me as kind of wrong. Like, it just felt off. And I said, I know they wouldn't do this in the Hunger Games movies, because its target audience is young adult, so PG-13. But I feel like it would be more fitting with the message it was trying to convey, if it were rated R. If it would actually show more realistic blood and violence that would actually happen in this situation. And my family immediately, they said, no, that doesn't make sense. That would just glorify violence too much. That would showing all of this gory stuff on like kids against kids, that would be bad. And so my argument basically was, for me, when it comes to a story that's trying to deliver this message, and obviously for the Hunger Games, although it's trying to be an entertaining young adult film, it has this underlying message of like kind of human nature and like the violent stuff that society can inflict upon us, and just the utter horrors of this situation of young children being forced to kill friends. And for me, a way to express that in a more like realistic, guttural way that really like gets the audience like understanding and feeling that would to be the show this horrific violence that really drives home the point that all of this violence is horrible. So in a way, showing more violence to have a stronger anti-violence opinion or message in this. So that was my initial thought, and then I was like, how can we kind of put that onto other forms of media, and like what in particular about maybe the Hunger Games, other types of movies might there be a better thing for more violence or less violence? So I wanted to talk about what I would say are kind of the two main categories when it comes to movies and games of what they're trying to accomplish. And so I would say most media, not everything. This is a generalization. It's kind of thought experiment. They're trying to either entertain or to inform. Obviously, there's some overlap. Entertaining movies can have some informative aspects, and informative movies also want to be entertaining. But when you watch a movie or you play a game, either you're going in and you're looking for a fun time, or you're going in for an interesting message. For instance, when you're going into Oppenheimer, for example, you're not looking for this just fun, wacky, goofy fun, just turn off your brain and have fun. No, you're looking for a more deeper, emotional, intellectual experience that actually teaches you something. Whereas if you're going into basically any horror movie, let's say like Friday the 13th, you're not looking for some like deep emotional experience, some kind of deep message there. No, you want to watch Jason Voorhees kill people, at least in the sequels, not the first one. So that's what I would say in the two camps of entertainment are those two categories. So, and the question arises, how does violence fit, or how should violence fit in terms of both of those categories? Now, if you have an entertaining or an informative movie that has, a mature kind of subject matter and is going for violent material as a core part of the experience, it's going to be different in how you implement it, and if it's supposed to be an entertaining media or if it's supposed to be an informative media. Let's take an example of two popular movies, John Wick and All Quiet on the Western Front, or insert basically any big war movie, Saving Private Ryan, for example. Now, for John Wick, although there is kind of, an informative undertone, there's messages about, grief and family and overcoming. There's deeper stuff in there. The reason you watch a John Wick film is to have fun, to watch John Wick shoot a bunch of dudes and do all of this just fun action nonsense. And the movie knows that, and it plays in to those elements. While obviously it does have, emotional, informative stuff, how it does its violence is oftentimes very cheesy and over the top. You'll see John Wick doing all this crazy, wacky stuff, stabbing people with pencils, tumbling down a billion flights of stairs, jumping out of a building and surviving. So the movie very clearly doesn't take itself too seriously. And in my opinion, that is the way, if you're going for an entertaining movie, that is how you need to do the violence, is you need to make it in a cheesy enough sense that it's very clearly for entertainment. This isn't a real example of violence, because that's not what the movie is trying to convey. Whereas on the flip side, a movie like All Quiet on the Western Front, which has a very staunch kind of anti-war message, and it has a lot of very extreme violence in it to drive home that point that I said before, to show that war is brutal and it's violent and it is bad in any and every circumstance because of all of this brutality and carnage and pain and suffering that it inflicts upon the people in there. Now, obviously, it wouldn't make sense if you had this deep message and you show all of this like wacky, cheesy violence that doesn't make sense. No, it needs like a more grounded, kind of guttural, kind of horrific type of violence to drive home its message. So both movies can, I think, use violence in good ways that both make the movies more entertaining, but in a good way, in like a cheesy way that's not trying to add like real guttural stuff where it doesn't fit. Or if it's an informative way, adding cheesy violence that kind of bogs down the message that it's trying to send home. Now, when it comes to video games, there's a couple of other examples that I would throw out there for like a first-person shooter, an entertaining one like Doom or Doom Eternal, where it's just like crazy, wacky violence. There's like fun sound effects going, and it's very clearly showing that like this is not like real violence in the world. This is just crazy, just eye candy, whereas something like Spec Ops: The Line has very brutal, intense, visceral violence, but that's kind of to portray like the message that it's trying to go for, like this, obviously just like All Quiet on the Western Front, a very staunch anti-war message. Or even like in horror games, a Resident Evil is a more cartoonish, fun, wacky game versus something like The Last of Us, which is trying to be more down to earth and to deliver a more straightforward message in there, and it's using its violence to do that. But then you get into the problem with all of this violence of desensitization. Because whether you're trying to entertain with your violence or you're trying to inform with your violence, the problem all comes down to, at some point you see enough violence that it's not going to affect you, potentially not just on the screen, but in the real world. And that potentially can be a problem, when you're in, like, you feel like this violent situations, and what should be the response is this, like, emotional, like, oh my gosh, this is bad, we got to do something about this, and just like, whatever. That's obviously the trap that you fall into when you have so much violent material. And this is the one category that I'm kind of stumped for, because although I very much enjoy violent material, whether that's fun, entertaining, I love me some Doom Eternal, or informative, because I do believe that violent material can better portray the message that the movie or game is trying to go for, there comes to a point where you see so much violence at a certain point that it doesn't, both of those impacts feel kind of weightless. And this is where I'm not sure quite where the solution is, because I think in both scenarios trying to censor or tone down the violence would take away from what the media was going for. I would say maybe there just needs to be some kind of like caution, where it's like we need to be very careful as to the kind of violence and how much we are showing. If we are doing violent material, it needs to be for a very clear purpose. And if there is just violence kind of for the sake of violence, that I believe is ultimately what is desensitizing to us, is that violence for no purpose, just out of nowhere, is, I believe, what makes us the most numb to violence. Whereas if we can have a more logical connection between, okay, this violence is happening and it's making me feel sad or horrific because of that, or if it's an entertaining way and it's violence, but it's not really violence, it's just like watching a cartoon, I believe that those, while there is still some problematic stuff there, I don't think it ultimately is quite as damaging as violence kind of for the sake of violence. And that transitions us to the next category I'd like to talk about, and that is what I would call kind of the no man's zone in terms of violence. This violence for the sake of violence that doesn't really fit either to entertain or to inform, or kind of tries to do both and really doesn't work at either. And is ultimately, I think, kind of harmful. Now let's talk about first, let's circle back to the Hunger Games, basically, and this works for the newest one, and I think kind of for the old series. Let's talk about first I think, good or better example of that style that's done in a Hunger Games-like series. And of course, I am referring to the ever-loved Squid Game. Now, this series, obviously, we watch it because it's fun seeing all of these traps and funky stuff. As I've said, informative media can have entertaining elements, but the main point of Squid Game is to drive home this message about poverty and corruption and what people will do to survive and to protect those that they love. And so all of this violent stuff that's happening is ultimately just driving home this just sad, depressive, horrific theme, and to show this message to the viewers that, just like all Quiet on the Western Front, that violence is bad, and the people who create scenarios that perpetuates this violence, that this is a massive problem that we have to confront. And if there wasn't quite so visceral or real violence, I don't think it would quite drive home that message enough. And then back to the Hunger Games, it's a similar situation where people are killing each other, just being forced to, friends are killing friends, and it's basically children who are being forced to do this. And yet, when there isn't showing this just horrific violence and almost just make it more of like a horror type thing, um, it kind of takes away from the real gut punch of the message that it's trying to convey, because it's kind of in a no man's land where it's an entertaining movie first, because it's a young adult film. It's trying to entertain all of these teenagers who just want to go and see a bunch of tributes kill each other. But that kind of entertaining commercialization of it is going against its deeper message of this anti-war, anti-violence thing of like the whole, kids killing kids. Like that should be horrific. That should horrify us. But the fact that it has kind of this pseudo-violent PG-13 kind of style, it takes away from its informative undertone and it leans it more into the entertaining style. So that's where I think there's kind of this no man's zone in violence, where it wants to kind of both have its cake and eat it. It wants to be an entertaining and an appeal to the young adult crowd. It also wants to have this message, but the way it does its violence kind of can't fit into either category, and in that way I think it ends up just becoming violence for violence, just kind of a desensitizing type of thing that is ultimately more harmful than it is good. I think another good example would be from the movie First Blood, Rambo First Blood, for people who don't know, versus First Blood 2, or basically any of the other ones. I've only seen the first two, but I think the difference is absolutely massive. In the First Blood, it's this huge kind of anti-war, anti-violence message that's going on. It's all about just trauma and PTSD and people not accepting veterans back into society and treating them well after Vietnam. And so, Rambo does everything in his power, although he does violent stuff and there's some pretty brutal violence in there. He does everything in his power to not kill the cops. And so, although there's violence, it's not just fun, wacky, goofy violence. It really makes you feel something, unlike basically all the other Rambo movies who build off of this story and they try to have this anti-war message, but they have some of the goofiest, most over the top violence and action in here. Kind of Rambo Part 2 is like the stereotypical 80s shirtless, muscly dude killing a ton of people. Rambo's going against the no killing in the first movie. And I think it's absolutely, once again, it's betraying its informative kind of message that it's trying to have on its undertone, because it's trying to appeal to a crowd is just like, yeah, let's just watch blood and carnage and type of thing. So once again, it's trying to do both things, and it ultimately makes it just a desensitizing type of violence that is ultimately pointless. Over in the video game side of things, I think a absolutely great example is looking at Battlefield 1 versus Battlefield 2049. Whereas Battlefield 1, you're taking place in World War I, and there's just a lot of just dirty, gritty elements of this. There's a story mode that like drives home this, once again, an anti-war message. Obviously, there's some more difficulties when it comes to first-person shooters and like the ethics and the desensitization there. But kind of as a whole, it really demonstrates kind of the horrors and like the realistic brutality that comes from warfare and World War I in particular. Whereas Battlefield 2049 is really weird because it has this backstory of this kind of post-apocalyptic type world where people are desperately fighting for survival, and then at the same time you've got all of these characters who are doing all of these like fun like Fortnite quips, and they're doing these goofy dances, and they're basically becoming cartoon characters. And so in that case, it's once again, it's trying to have this informative message, then it's also trying to have this quirky cartoon, just haha, fun violence for the sake of violence type of thing. And once again, it is absolutely missing the point, and it becomes a violence that is ultimately more harmful than it is good. So wrapping this up, I think my main takeaways from this is that obviously I do like violent media, and I think violent media is both can be both entertaining and informative in good ways. What it can't be is both at the same time. When movies or games or any kind of media try to both have this informative message but also push forward this violent, on the forefront, just come see the carnage type of a thing, it doesn't work. While there's definitely more to be said about kind of the desensitization and what settings are better to display violence in this type of media, what kind of age groups should violence be shown on, there's obviously, this is such a complicated issue and I'd love to hear people's perspectives. Ultimately, my opinion is violence is good, violence can be important, but we have to be very careful in how we implement it because it, I think, overall can be detrimental and can affect the development and how we think about the world and violence in a negative way if we don't do it correctly. But yeah, those are my thoughts. Let me know in the comments, what did you think of this style of video? What are your thoughts on violence in media? Do you think anything goes? Do you think it's kind of a mix in the middle? Do you think it should be way more censored? So let me know, and let me know if you'd like some other kind of more rambly philosophical videos like this. But yeah, that is all I've got for today. So I will see you later.